Hello folks, my name is Tikitu. I'm delighted to be able to give this CocoaHeadsNL talk. I'm looking forward very much to when we can do these things in person, but in the meantime it's lovely that I can do this from a distance and still reach you all. This is a recorded talk, so if you're watching live, then round about now I should be waving over in the CocoaHeadsNL Slack. If you're watching back later so you can hear me at double speed, I'm probably still in the CocoaHeadsNL Slack. I hang out there, and you can also find me on Twitter. I'm very happy to answer any questions you might have. I work for a company called Minddistrict. What Minddistrict does is we make a platform which is used by therapists and other kinds of mental health providers to give better therapy to the people that they're trying to help. I build the mobile apps, iOS and Android apps, and those are actually used by the people who are being helped, and we'll see some examples of what that looks like a little later. At Minddistrict, we've built a nice little piece of tooling, an accessibility snapshot test tool, which we use to make it easier to provide high-quality VoiceOver support in our iOS app, and that's what I'm going to tell you about today. I should warn you, if you do go find me over on Twitter, these aren't the only kinds of bugs that I'm interested in. I also take photographs of things with big claws and mandibles. If you see the claws and mandibles, that's still me. That's not the kind of bugs we're going to talk about today. So today I want to show you first what our tool actually does. You will look at it and go, oh. Then I want to back away from that and come in from the other direction and talk about what good VoiceOver support means when you have, say, non-trivial layouts, anything that's more than just kind of putting things in a column and leaving it there. I want to spend a bit of time on snapshot testing as a general methodology. I think in some sense this is the most important part of the talk. If there's only one thing that you take away from this talk, it's you should write snapshot tests. This tool is absolutely fantastic. You should be using it. It will make your lives easier. So if you're not already, this is the place to really pay attention. I'm going to show an open source tool built by the Point Free folk, which is really lovely to use, and that's what our tool is built on top of. So our tool is actually only about one small page of Swift. It's really a tiny thing. It's built on top of course, all the VoiceOver technology that Apple provides and the Point Free snapshot testing toolkit. That's how we can achieve so much with really a very tiny piece of code. So once I've introduced all that kind of groundwork, then we'll take another look at the output of our tool, and by now we should be able to actually understand what it's telling us and see why it solves this quite important problem for VoiceOver support. First I should make a disclaimer though. If you have heard anything about snapshot testing for accessibility on iOS, you've probably seen this screenshot. This is not us. This is not the approach that we're taking. This is a visual snapshotting approach. We're doing a textual snapshot instead. I don't say that this one's wrong. It works slightly differently, and it will probably give you something different to what we're looking for. You can use them both. They're both open source, and they're both built on the same underlying tool also. So go for it. Our one looks like this. This is a textual snapshot. This is actually a Git diff. So it's literally a diff of a text file showing that some things have changed that are relevant for VoiceOver in one of our views. It's a little hard to interpret. So let's start from the other end. Let's start by looking at VoiceOver, and then we'll work back to how we can read something like this and learn from that, not only what changed in the VoiceOver land, but exactly what went wrong and how we can fix it. Okay, VoiceOver. If you're not already knowledgeable about VoiceOver, you should be. It's really a core piece of technology for iOS developers. It's a screen reader, meaning that it reads out as text, as spoken text, the stuff that it can find on the screen. Mostly textual elements, literally text being read out, but also affordance information. This is a button, you can click it. These are things you can do with what you're seeing. And so its core use case is for completely blind users, also partially sighted users, people with various kinds of visual difficulties will use it. I think it's also used by some people who have difficulties with reading for various reasons, cognitive disabilities or what have you. But really the core use case is for blind or partially sighted users. To turn it on, you can go into Settings, General Accessibility Shortcut. That gives you an easy shortcut to turn it on and off again. You will find that very useful because it's not the kind of thing you want to have running all the time if you don't need it. But you definitely should be playing with it every now and again to build empathy for this core group of users who, the way they interact with your app is very, very different to how you, if you're a sighted user, how you'll interact with it. Once you've turned that on, you should also try the 3-finger triple tap that turns on a thing called Screen Curtain. What that does is it blanks the device, so it looks as if it's off, but all the input and output is still working just as it used to. So the accessibility focus can still focus elements, it will read them out, you can tap buttons, you can do everything you could with VoiceOver before, but you don't see any of it. And this is really important, again, for building empathy. When I first started experimenting with VoiceOver, I didn't have the screen curtain turned on, and I thought I was doing pretty well in understanding how a blind user would interact with my app. I was using VoiceOver and kind of navigating through it and doing okay. When I turned on the screen curtain, all those skills disappeared, and I realized that without really being conscious of it, I was using visual information to inform how I used the VoiceOver technology. And so turning on the screen curtain is, again, this way to really lift your empathy for people who have no visual modality at all and still need to interact with your app. The interaction model is quite different to what you're used to as a sighted user. So you should have a look at the Apple docs. They introduce that quite carefully. They talk you through how you should think about using VoiceOver, as well as how you should think about supporting it as a developer. Both as a user and as a developer, those docs are good. So this is a screenshot of the homepage of Minddistrict's app, and it shows a user who's been given 2 pieces of therapeutic content by their therapists. They have a module called Rumination, which is a way for the therapist to give them information. They can read pages of text, they can watch videos and so on that the therapist has chosen for them. And they have a diary, the Rumination ABC diary. A diary is a tool which prompts them to answer a number of questions and then collects up the answers to those questions into a diary entry. And you can see this user has made 3 entries. You can look back over those entries and learn things about your progress or gain insights, about the thing that you're struggling with. This person obviously is dealing with a problem with rumination, sort of obsessively thinking over things, spinning the wheels of your mind is one way to think about that. So what I tried to do looking at this page is to list all the things that I can learn from looking at it that are not present in the textual information which is by default available to a tool like VoiceOver. So VoiceOver is a screen reader. It will read out text, whatever text is on the page, by default. Minddistrict, rumination, what are the pros of ruminating, 4 milestones. These things are all available for VoiceOver to read out. It will also tell you a little about the affordances. The buttons will be listed as buttons, and the fact that you can tap them is also information that VoiceOver has. But there's a huge amount of information in the screen available to a sighted user that VoiceOver doesn't see yet. And I just tried to list everything I could see on this page. There are images. The image of the woman's face, it's not telling you something directly about the rumination content, but what it is doing is it's allowing you to recognize that same rumination module if it turns up elsewhere in the app. It will have the same poster image, and so you can recognize very quickly without having to listen to the word rumination or parse the word rumination. You can recognize this is something that I see again in different places. There are icons all over the screen. Top left has something looking like a profile icon. There is a diary icon, a little book. There are icons in the tab bar. Some of these do have a textual equivalent, which is great, but some of them don't. And the ones that don't will need some additional VoiceOver support. Otherwise, that information is just lost. More subtly, there is an information hierarchy available in the choices of font styling. If I asked you which was the title and which is the subtitle of Rumination and what are the pros of ruminating, you'd be able to tell me. The styling makes clear that one of these is a broad notion and one is a narrow notion. Rumination in this case is a chapter heading, and what are the pros of ruminating is a page heading. There are the affordances I mentioned, so the fact that you can tap these buttons is visually available. As I said, Minddistrict. VoiceOver does have that information available in the case of buttons, but not if you implement any custom solution for that, of course. There is some purely non-textual information. So the above 4 milestones, there is a progress bar, and that's actually showing its level of progress without any textual equivalent whatsoever. So that will need custom VoiceOver support to make sure that that information is available as well. There are some label value pairings. So in the diary tile, the last entry today at 15:58 is a label and its value. And we've indicated that in the design just by juxtaposing them, by placing them close together with related font families. Again, that juxtaposition is not available to VoiceOver. And finally, perhaps the most important, visually, if you look at this page, you see there are two things. We call them tiles, the Rumination tile and the Rumination diary tile, or the module tile and the diary tile. There's two concepts, two clumps of information, and those loose individual labels, the 4 milestones, continue rumination. Those loose labels hang together because they have a visual boundary around them, and the visual styling, the layout, says that this is one information unit. None of that is available to VoiceOver either, and that's particularly important for the switch between visual modality and, say, textual auditory modality, because in the visual modality, you can at one glance see this whole shape. In the auditory modality, you need to listen to a voice that starts, speaks, and finishes, and it's much harder to clump things together in that sense. So if we want to capture as much as possible of this visual information in a way which is useful for VoiceOver users, there's a few quite simple things we can do to add really high quality VoiceOver support to this screen. Before we start with that though, I should say, if you have a layout which doesn't have these issues, if you can get away with just using the built-in iOS components, the buttons, the labels and so on, and turn on VoiceOver and get decent support from that, absolutely do it. The built-in support is already wonderful. And like anything else, as soon as you start doing something custom, you're taking on the challenge of supporting that custom solution to a high level of quality. So if you can just use the built-in stuff, absolutely go for it. With the layout we have, you'll find that if you just turn on the built-in stuff, the labels are too dissociated from each other. The fact that there are 4 pieces of text that all combine into the module tile is really too much for a VoiceOver user. So the most important thing that we did here is we made the tile view, the view as a whole, an accessibility element in itself. And what that means is we need to gather into that view all the information that we want VoiceOver to report for that tile. So instead of having the individual labels as the accessibility elements that VoiceOver interacts with, the tile as a whole is, and that means we can shape what VoiceOver says. If you were to trigger VoiceOver on this view, I can't actually show you that because I'm recording this video with the iPhone I would show it with, but I can pretend to be the VoiceOver voice. So if you were to trigger VoiceOver on the module tile, it would say something like module, rumination, page, what are the pros of ruminating? Progress, 15% of 4 milestones. So what we've done is we've collected all the things that we want to say about this in the individual parts of this tile and packed them into one little phrase. And that's really key for providing good support for VoiceOver users for this kind of custom layout. The other thing we've done is for each of those tiles, the diary and the module tile, there's really only one primary action that you can perform with that tile. The module tile has a continue button and the diary has the fill in button. We don't need to leave those as loose buttons. We can actually make those an accessibility action on the tile itself. And so a VoiceOver user can already trigger that action already from the tile without having to navigate deeper into the view hierarchy, without having to step through to the button itself. So with those two changes, we've really improved the VoiceOver support for this particular screen. Unfortunately, by doing those, we have set ourselves up to introduce a rather nasty bug in future. And now I want to show you how that can happen. So the chart feature, the diary feature that I described, it lets you answer a few questions, fill in a diary entry, and then it keeps track of those diary entries over time. Those questions might ask you to describe your thoughts, textual input, but they also might ask you to put in numbers. And in the case where you put in numbers, it can be useful, like in the health app, it can be useful to chart how those numbers have changed over time. So at some point a few years ago, the diary feature is quite old in the Minddistrict app by now, but a few years ago we added this charting feature and immediately put it on the homepage in the diary tile. You need access to these charts as well. We implemented that with standard buttons, out-of-the-box buttons, and so we feel like, hey, this is great. We have VoiceOver support for buttons. We're done, right? Unfortunately, because we made the diary tile the accessibility element, these buttons are not visible to VoiceOver. They live inside the tile view, and the tile view provides its own accessibility label and so forth, its own accessibility properties. So at some point, somewhere in our development process, we would discover that we have introduced a rather serious accessibility bug. There's a feature in the app which is simply not accessible to blind users. They have no way to trigger these buttons. Now I want to take a small sidestep and be a bit cynical. This is about when in your development process you want to discover this kind of mistake. Because accessibility is sometimes a bit of a hard sell for the business side of a company. If you're lucky, then you can just use built-in components and accessibility support comes kind of for free, more or less. But typically it will cost some extra development time on top of building the feature itself to also provide support, especially for VoiceOver. VoiceOver is also a bit tricky. If you look at something like dynamic type, a huge number of people actually use variable font sizes in their settings and turn on the dynamic type feature. VoiceOver, it's only a relatively small number of users, and those users, especially completely blind folk, will be completely unable to use your app unless the VoiceOver support is up to scratch. So if you don't already have decent VoiceOver support, you may even have analytics saying we don't need to add it because nobody is using it. That's because nobody can use your app. So it can be a bit of a hard kind of business case to make if it's going to be expensive to add good quality VoiceOver support. Minddistrict is lucky in this respect for somebody like me who cares about this. We actually have a legal requirement because we make a health product. We have all sorts of compliance reasons to need at least a baseline level of accessibility support. So I don't need to go and sell this to the business folk. But still, if you really care about making a good experience for users in this class, you need to be able to sell that it's going to be easy, that's not going to slow down the development process. And I think the most important thing for that is when you have made a mistake like this, you want to catch that as early as possible in the development process. In particular, you don't want to have at some point kind of a manual acceptance testing phase where somebody turns on VoiceOver and checks if they can navigate through the app, and they find that they're missing something, and that comes back to you, but you're already in your new sprint. The feature was already, air quotes, shipped. You really want to catch this earlier than that. And that's where the techniques of snapshot testing come in, because this is what this makes possible. It's moving the accessibility testing, the VoiceOver support testing, from the kind of manual acceptance testing end of the development process kind of moment earlier into the unit testing part of the development process moment. So let's talk about snapshot testing. Snapshot testing is wonderful. The point-free snapshot testing toolkit is wonderful. I think, honestly, if you haven't already used snapshot testing, the most impactful thing you can take away from this talk is go and give it a try. You will find it magical. How snapshot testing works is you write a test which sets up some state in your app. Typically, this is a UI state, and so this is a visual snapshot. You're snapshotting your view hierarchy, say, or a view controller. The test then has an assertion line which says, assert that the snapshot matches what it used to. The very first time you run this test, it will construct your view hierarchy, take a picture of it, and save that picture into your file system. That picture is now the gold standard. Every time you should commit that gold standard into your repo, right? That's part of your test fixture, is actually that gold standard exists. Every time you run the test now, it will go look in the file system, find that gold standard. It will take a new snapshot of the UI as it is now and compare it to the gold standard. And by default, any difference whatsoever, so it's a byte by byte comparison, any difference whatsoever makes the test fail. Point freeze tooling will also, I believe, let you tune just how pixel perfect it needs to be. I haven't felt the need so far, actually. You do need to be a bit careful about, for instance, not including today's date in your snapshot test, because that will start failing as soon as the date changes. Not including times, this kind of stuff. You need to control your environment quite carefully, but that's all good test hygiene anyway. And yeah, after that, what you get is the test will fail if the images don't match. The point free tooling also gives you a nice diff output saying exactly what failed, what didn't match. I think I can show that on the next slide. Yes, yep. So this is a classic visual snapshot test, right? We're not into the accessibility snapshotting yet. I recorded another homepage with a couple of diary tiles on it. On the left, you see a before and after I made some small changes to the viewer implementation. It's actually quite hard to see the problem by eye. If you look very closely, you might catch it. But the black screen there is what the point free snapshotting toolkit does. Is it does an image subtraction. So it's byte by byte subtracting one image from the other. And if they're identical, then the result is black. It's all zeros. But everywhere that they are not identical, you get a non-black pixel. And so all these little scraps of orange and white that you can see over here, those are indicating where the problem was. In particular, from this one, I can see that the button has moved up slightly. And in fact, what I changed, or what I broke, was a minor detail of vertical spacing. All right, so that's how sort of the standard snapshot test works. And then point freeze tech is really, really nicely designed as an architecture to allow you to swap in other kinds of snapshot testing and still get the benefit of the kind of the general structure of a snapshot test. So the top line of code here, assert snapshot matching homepage as image, that's the one that generated the snapshot that I just showed. The next line is the one that generated our recursive accessibility snapshot. Point freeze tech lets you add a snapshot strategy. That's the .image and the .recursive accessibility description. These are snapshotting strategies. A strategy turns the input into one of a number of formats. Image is one of those formats, but also lines of text is another. I think also playlist files is another supported strategy, supported format, sorry. And if you have a strategy which generates any kind of information into these formats, you can plug that into Point Freeze Snapshotting Toolkit, and it will handle things like writing the output to a file, naming the file based on your test name, making sure you can find it back later, running a diff, putting the results of that diff in as a test failure, as a nicely annotated test failure, all this kind of stuff. So that's very elegant design. They want you to snapshot not just views, not just visual stuff, but everything. You can snapshot your network requests and get a dump of the JSON you're sending over your network. You can snapshot the JSON serialization of your models, also your codable serialization. You could, if you're using an architecture which lets you trace events through your app, you could just record an event trace as a list of events and then snapshot that as you go through some use case in your test code. These can all be snapshotting strategies, and the Point Free Toolkit will let you plug those in very easily. So it's really, really worth a look. For the view snapshots, the wonderful thing is because the snapshot just records the visual output, you can completely refactor everything that lives underneath that, and if it ends up looking the same, then your snapshot test passes. You're confident that you haven't broken anything. So this toolkit is really wonderful for allowing refactoring with confidence. It's a very powerful set of ideas. What we did with that is we added a snapshot strategy that we called a recursive accessibility description. It's loosely based on a strategy which was already included in the point free toolkit, which is a recursive view hierarchy description. I think they just called it recursive description. So it does a similar kind of thing to that. It dumps the view hierarchy as an ASCII formatted tree. So indentation indicates depth into the tree, and we have some little ASCII glyphs that show parent-child relationships. We only show views that either are accessibility elements or that have some child or deeper nested child that is an accessibility element. Or put differently, we show the accessibility elements and their ancestors. So basically we show the part of the tree that's relevant for accessibility, for VoiceOver only. And we add a whole bunch of information which is making visible what VoiceOver has to work with when it looks at these elements. So all the accessibility properties that we care about, basically. So let's take another look at that diff, which indicated that we had a problem. This is the diff from a failing test. With snapshot tests, I often find it convenient to not look at the diff actually in Xcode as a test failure diff, but to re-record the test and look at the diff in a Git diff viewer. Sometimes this is handy. So that's the view that we have here. I re-recorded the test, and now I have to decide, should I save this change? Is this actually a new gold standard, or have I uncovered a bug? Well, if I look closely at what this is telling me, these are views that are relevant for VoiceOver. So we have a diary tile link button, that's a custom view. It contains a stack view, and that contains a label, which has an accessibility label. So this would be read out by VoiceOver. And it contains a button which has the accessibility trait button. So again, that would be read out by VoiceOver. If I look at that, the diary tile link button contains an accessibility bug. Most definitely, this is not a good VoiceOver implementation because it's used a separate label view and button view. I think we did that because the layout was not easy to get with a UI button. And that means that VoiceOver doesn't know to connect the label, how did it feel, the accessibility label, how did it feel, to the trait, I'm a button, you can click me. Okay, so this would already be we can't ship this. This has an accessibility bug. At Minddistrict, we didn't add accessibility support to this diary tile link button because this diff also indicates something else, and that was the problem that I mentioned when we looked at the screen itself. The column on the left of pipe symbols, we add that when you're looking at a view which is itself an accessibility element, which means that its subviews are not accessible to VoiceOver. So this column indicates all the stuff is going on inside the context of an element which has already said I'm responsible for VoiceOver support. Whatever you put in here doesn't matter. So this diff stays really clear, apart from the slightly subtle bug which you look in detail at this and go, hey, this guy doesn't have good accessibility support. This says very clearly we've added some things that are accessibility relevant, but those pipe symbols say VoiceOver won't do anything with them. That's a bug. That's definitely not acceptable accessibility support. So let's go and fix it. And we did fix it. The fix was to add those actions also at the level of the tile. And you can see the result again in a Git diff. This is the diff that we would commit, as this is the change that we like. This is going to become our new gold standard for the accessibility snapshot of this element. Because this one says we've added these new elements. They don't have good accessibility support, but we don't care because they live inside something which is itself an accessibility element. And that thing, the tile view, has two new custom actions. Those custom actions correspond to those two diary tile link buttons. So one of them, the action is bar chart, how did it feel? And that will trigger the same action as the button on the how did it feel chart. And the other is line chart, how much did you ruminate? Again, this corresponds to this visual element deeper inside. So if I now save this file, add it to my pull request, push it off to Jenkins, and the test passes again, I'm also saying explicitly, I believe that this is the right way for this view to behave. I believe that this is acceptable VoiceOver support, and this is, my job is now done. I like that a lot. I like the fact that when we notice something going wrong because of these tests failing, we have to actively take some kind of action to fix things up. The test will continue failing until we either fix the bug, if we introduced a bug, or commit a new gold standard for the test. Either way, there will be some kind of record of what we were doing and why. Right? So when you re-record your snapshots, you're really saying actively, I believe this is a new gold standard. I'm stamping my name on it. That goes into my pull request. That goes into our Git history. It's part of the history of our app. That's great. These tests are going to fail while I'm working on the feature and not later, because they're unit tests. I need to have them passing before I land my branch. And so I've still got the pull request open. I'm still working actively on this. It's in my mind. It's the best time for me to be fixing this. It's the lowest possible development cost for fixing a problem like this. Once you learn to read this diff, there's quite a lot of information in those visual glyphs, right, in all the ASCII glyphs. But once you learn to read this diff, it will actually tell you very directly what the problem is. It's not just test failed, you need to go figure it out. The diff really will tell you what has changed, and that will guide you in figuring out how to make things okay. Sometimes how to make things okay is just to accept things have changed and I like it. But if that's not the case, that diff will also tell you fairly clearly what you should do about it. In this case, that was following the pipes up until you find the parent item, and then the parent view, and then noticing, hey, that parent view, that needs to get an equivalent of these new views in its VoiceOver support. The last 2 points here are kind of a matched pair. There are a bunch of changes you can make to the visual look and feel of your app which will not trigger these tests to fail. So that's the positive side. There are lots of changes you can make which don't need any accessibility attention, and the tests won't force you to give them accessibility attention. Unfortunately, there are also some changes you can make which are not relevant for accessibility, for VoiceOver support, but which will make these tests fail. Even just renaming classes, because the classes are mentioned in that hierarchy, you will need to re-record all your tests if you've done just a rename refactor. Sort of anything that adjusts the hierarchy that these things live in, you're going to need to re-record. But there's a whole bunch of visual changes that you can make that don't even show up in the textual diff, because we're not dumping all the visual information we have. We're stripping it back to kind of the bare minimum. What we've found is this does actually catch bugs. And if it's catching bugs for me, then I'm willing to live with the occasional false positive having to re-record tests. It's also typically easy to look at that diff and say, yeah, I can see that in fact this doesn't make a difference, and so I'm just going to rubber stamp, we'll accept this change and move on. So for us, this is a good trade. As I said, there is the Cache App alternative, which takes that trade-off differently. Because they're actually visually snapshotting the UI. If you make visual changes, they will show up in your accessibility snapshots also. You might find that that's more appropriate for you. Like everything else in development, there's a bit of a trade-off there, a seesaw. Have a try and see what feels more comfortable for you. Our one is open source, or at least by the time this video goes live, it will be. I'm still figuring out the packaging, but it's on its way. So you can play with it, you can use it. I hope you can also improve it and give us pull requests, and we'll fold those back in. That's how open source is supposed to work. Thank you very much for your attention.